I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
The music was still playing when Princess Anne suddenly stopped walking. Guests were smiling, aides were moving through the garden, and nothing suggested the afternoon was about to collapse into one of the most painful confrontations inside the royal family. Then an aide stepped close and delivered a message Anne had never expected to hear. Several personal items once associated with Diana had been removed, and Camilla was said to have taken possession of them. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne did not move at first. She turned toward the trusted aide beside her and asked him to repeat every word. The gathering around them was a formal palace garden event, a tightly managed royal engagement where invited guests, household staff, senior aides, and family members followed a precise schedule. Any sudden interruption would be noticed instantly. Yet the princess no longer cared about appearances. The aide repeated the warning. Queen Camilla had taken several personal items connected to Diana from restricted royal storage, and Anne had not been informed before the transfer. Camilla saw the change from across the gathering. She watched Anne's face harden, noticed staff beginning to hesitate, and understood this was not a routine delay. The queen consort recognized the difference between an administrative problem and a personal crisis. Anne demanded to know what had been removed. Restricted royal storage meant a controlled collection area, where sensitive or historically important possessions were kept under limited access, not an ordinary room anyone could enter freely. The aide's next words made that distinction painful. He explained that the objects were not random decorations. They were personal possessions, preserved because of their emotional connection to Diana and her sons. Anne's shock turned into anger. She asked who approved the transfer, where the items had been taken, and whether William or Harry had been consulted. The aide could not give her every answer. That silence told her enough. Anne made the decision in seconds. She ordered the music stopped and told senior staff the event could not continue until she knew who authorized the removal and where items were held. Camilla remained where she was, but the distance between them felt enormous. Then came the detail that transformed concern into suspicion. The aide said Camilla had requested access days earlier. This had not begun in the garden. It had begun before anyone realized Anne was watching. What looked like an abrupt interruption was about to become something far more personal, because the objects at the center of the dispute carried memories that neither Anne nor Camilla could treat as ordinary palace property. For Princess Anne, the argument was never simply about jewelry, photographs, or boxes stored behind palace doors. Diana's belongings represented a chapter of royal history filled with affection, pain, fractured loyalties, and memories that still shaped William and Harry decades later. For Camilla, however, the same objects carried another kind of weight: the uncomfortable shadow of a woman whose presence remained powerful long after her death. That difference made compromise almost impossible. Anne carried a deeply traditional view of sensitive royal possessions. She believed objects connected to painful family history should never be treated like ordinary property, especially when they still carried emotional meaning for living relatives. Provenance, the recorded history of where an important object came from and who possessed it, mattered because it protected more than value. It protected memory. That was why the princess had always believed William and Harry deserved consideration whenever something closely tied to their mother was moved, displayed, or reassigned. Camilla occupied a different position. As queen consort, meaning the wife of the reigning king, rather than the sovereign herself, she had legitimate access to parts of the royal household that placed her near collections associated with earlier generations. That access gave her influence, but it also carried risk. Anything linked to Diana could never be emotionally neutral. The Queen understood that better than most, because every decision involving those possessions could revive questions the family had spent years trying to quiet. Anne sat down privately with the aide, who had approached her in the garden, and asked the question she had been holding back. Had William been consulted? The answer came through a documented internal account prepared after the transfer. No request had been made to him before the items were moved. Her disappointment deepened immediately. She did not shout. She simply asked for the inventory. Camilla, meanwhile, turned to a senior attendant and asked whether Anne knew exactly which possessions had been taken. The attendant confirmed that she did. Her composure tightened. The Queen now understood that the princess had not halted the event over a vague concern. She knew the details. Then Anne read the list. A small velvet jewelry case. A handwritten personal keepsake. Several pieces preserved separately because of their connection to Diana. Worse, the aide explained that they had been moved together, in one organized transfer, rather than individually over time. That changed everything. To Anne, it suggested intention. The question could no longer be avoided. Why had Camilla wanted those particular possessions? And what had happened earlier to make Anne so certain they should never have been touched without discussion? To understand why Anne reacted so sharply, the story has to return to the private moment when concerns over Diana's belongings first became impossible for the family to ignore. The confrontation in the garden did not begin that afternoon. Its true starting point came weeks earlier, inside a private collection room, during what should have been an uneventful review of royal possessions. Anne had expected a routine discussion about preservation and future family access. Instead, one seemingly simple request involving Diana's belongings changed the atmosphere immediately. A question was asked, an answer was avoided, and from that moment forward, Anne began watching the collection far more carefully. Princess Anne had long believed certain possessions carried more than historical value. Objects connected to deceased members of the family could become deeply personal, because ownership, memory, grief, and family expectation were often impossible to separate. A private collection review was simply an internal examination of important royal possessions, checking what was held, where it was stored, and how it might be preserved or used. For Anne, that process mattered, because Diana's most sensitive belongings were not ordinary ceremonial pieces. They carried emotional weight for William, Harry, and eventually Diana's grandchildren. Anne had already pushed for those possessions to remain clearly catalogued. She wanted every significant keepsake recorded, so the family would always know where it was and why it mattered. William and Harry had both lived through the loss behind those objects, and the princess believed future generations deserved the same clarity. That was why what happened 3 weeks before the garden event struck her so sharply. Camilla turned to the archivist during the review and asked whether several items associated with Diana could be temporarily moved to rooms used by the Queen for a forthcoming private display. The request sounded simple. Anne immediately looked up. She asked exactly which pieces were being considered, and then told Camilla that anything personally connected to Diana should first be discussed with William. Camilla answered that the request was administrative, not emotional. She argued that the objects would remain within royal custody and would only be moved temporarily. Anne was not persuaded. She closed the inventory folder and made her position unmistakable. Nothing closely tied to Diana should leave its designated place until the family understood what was happening. Anne acted quietly after the meeting. She instructed a trusted aide to contact her directly if any of the identified pieces were moved without another discussion. The warning was not dramatic, but it was deliberate. She had sensed something unresolved, and she refused to ignore it. Then the garden event happened. The same aide approached Anne and delivered the message she had feared. The items had been moved. That single detail destroyed the idea of a misunderstanding. Anne now believed her earlier warning had been bypassed, and there was only one thing left to do. The warning Anne had prepared for finally arrived, and this time there would be no archivists, no ceremonial language, and nowhere for either woman to hide behind protocol. Anne did not raise her voice when Camilla entered the private room. That made the moment more dangerous. The garden event had been suspended. Confused guests remained outside, and two senior royal women now stood facing each other with no crowd to soften what had to be said. Anne placed the list of missing possessions on a table between them and asked one question. "Why were these moved after I told you William should be consulted?" Princess Anne refused to treat the dispute as a battle over status. To her, it was about trust, family memory, and an understanding that anything closely connected to Diana would be handled carefully. Royal custody meant the objects were still officially held within the household rather than privately owned by one individual. But that distinction did little to calm her. Camilla argued that the items had never left royal control and that she believed moving them for private household use was legitimate. Anne pushed the inventory list toward her and stayed standing. She wanted a direct answer, not another explanation wrapped in procedure. Camilla kept her hands on the back of a chair and said she had never intended to disrespect Diana or hurt her sons. The Queen Consort insisted the transfer had been temporary and that she believed the objects would remain properly protected. That answer wounded Anne more than it reassured her. She told Camilla that intention was not the only thing that mattered. William and Harry would still feel the effect of seeing their mother's possessions moved without being consulted. The princess reminded her that this was exactly why she had objected during the earlier review. A warning had been given. It had not been vague. Then Camilla admitted something Anne had not expected. She had personally selected several of the pieces after seeing them during the earlier collection review. Staff had not simply chosen a random group. The Queen had identified the objects herself because she believed they suited the private display she had in mind. Anne looked back at the list. One entry stopped her cold: the small velvet case. She had specifically warned that this item should remain untouched until William had been informed. Suddenly, the dispute was no longer about poor communication. To the princess, it looked like a clear decision had been made, despite her objection. Camilla defended herself again, but Anne had already reached the point where neither woman could settle the matter alone. Someone with greater authority had to decide whether the transfer would stand. The argument had reached the point where family feeling collided with royal authority, and Anne knew the next conversation would force the king to choose between avoiding conflict and correcting what had happened. Charles received the news without interruption. Anne spoke first. Camilla answered second. Then the room fell silent, because everyone understood that his next words would carry more than administrative weight. Diana was part of his past. Camilla was his wife. Anne was his sister. And the possessions now dividing them belonged emotionally to a history the monarchy had never fully escaped. For once, refusing to make a decision would itself become a decision. Charles understood why the dispute had reached him. As king, meaning the sovereign with final authority over major household decisions, he could not treat the transfer as a private disagreement between two relatives. The issue now involved royal control, family expectations, and objects carrying unusual emotional weight because of their connection to Diana. Anne kept her argument simple. "Return the items first," she said, "then discuss any future display openly with the people closest to that memory." Charles took the inventory and read it carefully. He moved through each entry without speaking until he reached the small velvet case. Then he stopped. The king set the paper down and looked directly at Camilla. Had William known? The Queen Consort hesitated before admitting that he had not been consulted. She explained that she believed the transfer remained within proper household authority, but the answer changed the mood instantly. Charles did not humiliate her. That restraint made his disappointment more powerful. He asked whether staff had raised concerns before the objects were moved. Anne watched him closely as the reply came through a documented internal account. Several members of staff had questioned the transfer, but they proceeded because Camilla's instruction appeared to carry enough authority. The king now understood that this was not simply a misunderstanding between family members. People had seen the danger and still felt unable to stop it. Charles made the decision slowly but firmly. Every disputed item would be returned to its previous storage location, while a full review took place. A review meant a formal rechecking of the transfer, the authorization behind it, and the future handling of the possessions. Anne did not celebrate. She only nodded. For her, the decision restored a boundary that should never have been crossed. Camilla remained composed, but the meaning was impossible to miss. Charles had reversed her decision. The king had chosen correction over convenience, and the queen consort now had to face what that ruling said about trust. The possessions were going back, yet the most painful part of the confrontation was only beginning. Everyone now had to live with what the king's decision said about trust inside the family. When the decision reached Camilla's rooms, there was no public argument and no dramatic protest. Instead, the consequences arrived quietly. A senior aide placed the written instructions on the table, confirmed that the belongings would be returned, and waited. Camilla read the first page, removed her glasses, and said nothing for several seconds. The dispute had moved beyond Anne's anger. Charles himself had ruled that Diana's possessions should go back. Camilla understood what the order meant. Palace staff had already begun reversing the transfer, checking each object against its earlier catalog position and preparing a record showing exactly where every piece would be restored. A catalog was simply the official record used to track important possessions, their location, and their history. That process mattered now because the family could not afford another gap between what paperwork said and where the objects actually were. The queen consort knew every entry would be checked. Confusion still hung over the suspended garden event. Aides were forced to give neutral explanations to guests, while senior members of the family dealt with the crisis behind closed doors. Camilla felt the weight of that silence more sharply than any public criticism. After her aide left, she remained alone and realized Anne's objection had not merely been heard. Charles had accepted it. The king had reversed her decision, and that left her exposed inside the very household where she had expected her authority to be enough. Anne felt no victory. She told the trusted aide beside her that the situation should never have reached the point where anyone was publicly embarrassed or privately humiliated. The princess had wanted the possessions protected, not a spectacle. Yet she also refused to soften her position. If Diana's belongings were being returned, every item had to be physically accounted for. A list alone would not satisfy her now. Then the inventory check produced another problem. One small personal keepsake was missing from the group being restored. A documented account from the staff handling the return showed that it had been separated from the others and placed in a different room during the transfer. Suddenly, the reversal was incomplete. Anne reacted immediately. She insisted that nothing could be described as resolved until the keepsake was found and personally checked. Camilla was informed as the search began, and the queen understood that one misplaced object had reopened the entire emotional wound. The missing keepsake changed the direction of the crisis. Anne now knew the person who most deserved an explanation could no longer remain outside it. The argument had begun as a dispute between two women, but the emotional center of the story now shifted toward the person for whom Diana's belongings carried the deepest personal meaning. There were no courtiers in the room when Anne finally spoke to William. No advisors softened the language, and no official explanation stood between them. She told him exactly what had happened, from Camilla's original request to the halted garden event, and Charles' decision to return the items. William listened without interrupting, but when Anne mentioned the missing personal keepsake, his expression changed. Suddenly, the dispute was no longer about protocol. It was about his mother. Princess Anne explained why she had stepped in. She believed William and Harry should have been consulted before anything deeply connected to Diana was moved. especially when those objects carried personal meaning beyond their formal place in a royal collection. The prince understood the distinction. Legal custody meant an institution could hold an object without that object emotionally belonging to the institution. Respect was different. For him, the question was not whether every piece connected to his mother was technically his. The question was whether her memory had been treated with care. William thanked Anne, but his hurt surfaced in a quieter question. Why had nobody contacted him when Camilla first made the request? He did not accuse her. That made the moment heavier. The future king simply wanted to know why a decision involving Diana's most personal possessions had moved so far before anyone thought to speak to her son. Anne answered carefully. She admitted she had hoped the matter could be corrected quietly before it ever reached him. The princess believed stopping the transfer early would protect William from another painful family argument. Instead, silence had allowed the situation to grow. She accepted that mistake without trying to defend it. Then the message they had been waiting for arrived through a documented account from the staff completing the search. The missing keepsake had been found. It had not left royal custody and had not been permanently removed. It had been set aside in a different room during the transfer and overlooked when the other objects were gathered for return. William felt relief, but he did not let the issue disappear with the discovery. He asked that the keepsake be restored with the others, and requested one simple safeguard: a written family consultation rule before Diana's most personal possessions could ever be moved again. Anne immediately understood why that mattered. A written rule could prevent emotion from being left to assumption. The crisis was finally beginning to close inside the family. But outside, the halted garden event had already created questions no private agreement could erase. Inside the family, the emotional temperature was finally lowering. Outside the gates, however, the sudden interruption had become a story of its own. By the following morning, the image everyone remembered was not a crown, a balcony, or a procession. It was Anne, standing motionless in the middle of a royal garden, while an aide spoke quietly into her ear. The unexplained halt had transformed a private disagreement into public fascination. Commentators debated duty, memory, and the enduring sensitivity surrounding Diana's legacy, while the palace faced a difficult truth. Even possessions hidden from public view could still carry enormous emotional power. Princess Anne disliked what followed. Public discussion quickly moved away from the value of the objects and towards something far more sensitive: why Diana's memory could still shake the family so deeply. That mattered, because the possessions were not important merely as royal artifacts. They represented grief, loyalty, motherhood, and the emotional history carried by William and Harry. Palace communications, meaning the official messages used to explain royal events to the public, stressed that the belongings were secure and that internal handling procedures were now under review. Anne reacted badly to claims that she had stopped the event to embarrass Camilla. In a documented private conversation with a senior aide, she insisted her concern had never been revenge. She wanted Diana's belongings handled properly, and the people emotionally connected to them consulted. The princess knew the public could turn a disagreement into a feud within hours, and she hated the idea that protecting a boundary might be mistaken for settling an old score. Camilla felt the pressure differently. She read the headlines and realized the incident had dragged her back into comparisons she had spent years trying to escape. The queen consort understood that Diana's name carried emotional force far beyond palace walls, and now one disputed transfer had revived that shadow again. She remained controlled, but the public framing hurt, precisely because it reduced a complicated household decision to a familiar rivalry. Outside Buckingham Palace, the mood became impossible to ignore. A small crowd gathered near the gates as television crews broadcast beneath a newspaper front page showing Anne leaving the garden event. Across the top ran 3 blunt words: Anne stops the party. That single headline captured the public feeling better than any formal statement could. Something serious had happened, and everyone wanted to know why. Then palace officials completed the final check. A documented internal account confirmed that every returned item had been examined individually, and that none remained outside the approved collection. The practical crisis was over. Charles now faced the emotional one. He called Anne and Camilla together for one final meeting, not to investigate what had happened, but to decide what respect would mean from that point forward. The world had formed its judgment from a frozen moment in a garden, but the real verdict would come behind closed doors, where 3 members of the family had to decide what respect would mean from that day forward. The crisis ended where it should have begun. With the possessions returned, the family informed, and the rules made clear. Anne entered the final meeting no longer furious. Camilla arrived knowing Charles would not reverse his decision. William had already made his wishes known. What remained was not a battle for victory, but a question of respect. Could the monarchy acknowledge the emotional weight of Diana's memory without allowing that memory to become another permanent source of division? Charles opened the meeting by confirming that every disputed item had been returned to its designated location and checked against a fresh inventory. An inventory was the formal record showing exactly what was held, where it belonged, and whether anything was missing. The king then approved a new consultation procedure, meaning senior members of the family would have to be consulted before highly personal possessions linked to deceased close relatives were moved for private use or display. It was a simple rule, but everyone understood why it mattered now. Anne turned directly to Camilla and made one thing clear. She had not halted the garden event to humiliate her, and she had never wanted a public feud. The princess acted because ignoring the transfer would have made her earlier warning meaningless. She believed silence would have damaged trust even more. Camilla listened without interruption, then accepted that the transfer should have been discussed first. The queen consort also admitted that the objects carried emotional meaning far beyond their place inside a royal collection. William's request became the compromise that finally ended the argument. The future king had not demanded punishment. He had asked for protection against repetition. That changed the entire tone of the dispute. Instead of deciding who had won, the family now had a clear safeguard that respected both royal custody and personal memory. Charles closed the inventory folder and spoke with finality. Diana's memory, he said, could not belong to one side of the family against another. The king believed it had to be handled with care for the people who loved her, and for the institution preserving her history. Anne accepted that principle. Camilla did too. The tension that had begun in the garden finally had somewhere to end. The verdict was clear. Anne's intervention had been about boundaries, not revenge. Camilla left chastened but not publicly condemned. William received reassurance that his mother's most personal legacy would be handled with greater care. Charles restored order, without pretending the pain underneath the dispute had never existed. The garden event had stopped because one aide whispered a warning, but what followed forced the family to confront something much larger. Diana's belongings were returned, the dispute was settled, and the boundary was made permanent. Royal history could be preserved by an institution, but personal memory still demanded respect. For Anne, that was the principle worth stopping everything to defend. And this time, the monarchy listened. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.